Good morning, colleagues. The 9,794th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objections, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Mohammed Ahadi, Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, to participate in the meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Mohammed Ahadi.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the Security Council, Excellencies. At the outset, I would like to convey the apologies of the Special Coordinator, Winsland, who asked me to deliver these remarks on his behalf due to unforeseen circumstances. Last week, Special Coordinator briefed the Security Council on the dynamics unfolding in Gaza, the occupied West Bank, and the broader region. Regrettably, the situation remains grave across the region. Israeli military operation continued across the blue line with Lebanon, as did the firing of rockets by Hezbollah towards Israel, including a barrage this weekend. I welcome the ongoing diplomatic efforts to reach a cessation of the hostilities and urge the parties to accept a ceasefire anchored in the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701. Special Coordinator also outlined a number of key principles that would lay the groundwork for a viable and sustainable political future for Israelis and Palestinians within a more peaceful and stable region. Since the conflict began, the United Nations has consistently urged the international community and the parties to chart a course towards peace. We continue to call for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and the de-escalation of tension around the region. We continue to demand immediate steps to improve the delivery of humanitarian assistance, which is failing to meet even the most basic needs of Gaza's population. We continue to call for political and security frameworks that would move us closer to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, ending the occupation, and achieving a two-state solution. Madam President, as the winter approaches, the horror in Gaza continues to grind on with no end in sight. In the more than 13 months of conflict, since the vicious attack by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups inside Gaza on 7th of October 2023, some 44,000 Palestinians and some 1,700 Israelis and foreign nationals have been killed. Over 100,000 Palestinians, many women and children, and tens of thousands of Israelis, including women and children, have been injured. 110 Israelis are still held in Gaza, being held in horrific conditions and denied humanitarian visits. Recent weeks have seen devastating intensification of IDF operations in North Gaza, with mass casualty incidents occurring with alarming frequency. On 10th November, 36 Palestinians, including women and children, were reportedly killed, while others were injured, when a multi-story building was hit in Jabali al-Balad. On 16 November in Beit Lahia, two separate Israeli airstrikes reportedly killed at least 65 Palestinians, including women and children, when buildings hosting IDPs were hit. These are but a small fraction of the deadly incidents that have occurred in recent weeks. The IDF has said it's targeting Hamas personnel and locations and takes steps to mitigate harm to civilians. On top of the daily carnage, we continue to witness displacement and destruction, including of civilians' infrastructure. Repeated evacuation orders issued by the IDF have triggered over 100,000 people to be displaced from northern Gaza southward since IDF ground operation resumed in the area on 6th of October. The resulting influx into Gaza City and surrounding has increased the population to some 375,000 people, with only an estimated 75,000 remaining in northern Gaza. Access to humanitarian aid remains a daily struggle and involves huge personal risks. Looting of humanitarian supplies by Palestinians is intensifying and becoming more organized and more violent. In one incident, on 16th of November, a UN convoy comprising of 109 trucks of food supplies was violently looted by Palestinians, with 97 trucks lost. On 18th of November, over 20 people were reportedly killed by armed Palestinians in an operation said to be led by the Gaza Ministry of Interior to target looters of humanitarian aid. I again unequivocally condemn the widespread killing and injury of civilians in Gaza and the endless displacement of the population. I also condemn the continued holding of hostages in Gaza and the indiscriminate firing of rockets toward Israeli population centers by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups, which has continued this month. Attacks on humanitarians and humanitarian convoys must cease immediately. Law and order must be restored, and civilian population have safe access to vital aid. Madam President, the levels of essential goods, including humanitarian assistance, that has been allowed into Gaza is inadequate to meet the overwhelming needs of the population. The campaign in Gaza to vaccinate against polio virus concluded having reached over 500,000 children. It demonstrates that what is possible when basic humanitarian operation requirements are met. As I warned in my capacity as a humanitarian coordinator, the delivery of critical aid across Gaza is grinding to a halt, and that the survival of 2 million people hangs in the balance. I urge Israel to fulfill its obligations to facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief into and throughout Gaza, and for all parties to respect safe delivery of assistance. Madam President, as we confront enormous challenges in Gaza, we're also witnessing the increasingly dangerous dynamics unfolding in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Violence has continued at alarming levels. During the reporting period, 32 Palestinians were killed, mostly in the context of ISF operations and clashes with armed Palestinians, including in Area A. The IDF says they are targeting Palestinians militants. While shooting and ramming attacks by Palestinians continued, no fatalities were reported in the occupied West Bank of Israel. Israeli settlers and other civilians also continued to attack Palestinian communities in the West Bank, many in the context of the olive harvest, while Palestinian attacks on Israelis also continue. The Israeli government has also continued its unrelenting advancement of settlement and its policy of evictions and demolition of Palestinian-owned structures. On 28th of October, Israeli planning authorities advanced approximately 120 housing units in settlements in Area C in the occupied West Bank. And on 5th November, Israeli forces demolished 9 homes in East Jerusalem. While these dangerous steps accelerate, some ministers are now openly calling for the annexation of the West Bank. I reiterate, the annexation consists of a violation of international law and must be firmly rejected. It is crucial that the Palestinian Authority is supported politically and financially. The waiver that allows Israeli banking system to cooperate with Palestinian banks is set to expire at the end of the month, once again threatening the Palestinian banking sector and economy. The use of this renewal letter as a perpetual threat of economic instability, alongside other unilateral steps that undermine the PA's fiscal stability, must end. Madam President, allow me to share a few final reflections from the Special Coordinator. Developments across occupied Palestinian territory, both Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, suggest we are at imminent risk of losing the frameworks we have been operating under since 1967 and 1973, when the Security Council adopted the resolution aimed at laying the foundations for a just and lasting peace. We must never allow for a repeat of the 7th October Hamas attacks and their aftermath. We must treat Gaza and the West Bank as a whole, integral to the vision of an independent Palestinian state, and avoid repeating the political and administrative divides of the past. We must preserve and strengthen the Palestinian Authority and its institutions. We must create the space for a political solution, not a violent one. If the forces seeking to undermine a two-state solution are successful, the collapse of the relevant principles and institutional structures will have a ripple effect that could spread far beyond the Middle East. The United Nations and this office, UNRWA, in particular, has a critical role to play in protecting and promoting the very frameworks the international community and the parties themselves have identified as the basis for a more peaceful and secure future. But this requires renewed support from the international community, particularly from the region, to create the enabling conditions for diplomacy to be effective. We need a ceasefire, we need to get the hostages out, we need lifeline-saving support to be delivered safely now, and we need to ensure the long-term safety and security of the Palestinians and the Israelis. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Hardy for his briefing, and I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Deputy Coordinator Hadi, for your briefing. The United States remains opposed to proposals to annex the West Bank or construct Israeli settlements in Gaza, which, if implemented, would be inconsistent with international law, sow the seeds of further instability, and create new obstacles to Israel's full integration into the region. We are also deeply concerned by increasing extremist settler violence in the West Bank. Recent incidents include those in Jurat al-Kil, near Hebron, where Palestinians were attacked by scores of extremist settlers who damaged property, assaulted civilians, and released dogs to attack residents. In the Palestinian village of Jalud, south of Nablus, dozens of extremist settlers reportedly killed livestock, attacked homes, and set fire to vehicles. We are concerned increased attacks also are preventing Palestinians from harvesting their olive crops. Beyond causing intense suffering for Palestinians, these attacks threaten Israel's security, make the realization of a two-state solution more difficult, and undermine the prospects for regional peace and stability. The government of Israel must deter extremist settler violence and protect all communities from harm. This includes intervening in, preventing, and stopping attacks. We urge the relevant authorities to do everything possible to de-escalate tensions and hold all perpetrators of violence accountable, no matter the background of the perpetrator or victim. Since February, the United States has sought to promote accountability by imposing sanctions on 17 individuals and 16 entities for their actions to undermine peace, security, and stability in the West Bank. Just last week, we sanctioned 3 entities and 3 individuals for their roles in violence targeting civilians or in the destruction or dispossession of property. Among these designated entities is Amana, the largest organization involved in settlement and illegal outpost development in the West Bank, and its subsidiary, Binyane Bar Amana. Amana has established dozens of illegal settler outposts and directly engaged in dispossession of private land owned by Palestinians in its support of settlers. As Secretary of Defense Austin made clear to his Israeli counterpart, we are also concerned about Israel's decision to stop using administrative detention orders against settlers suspected of attacks against Palestinians in the West Bank. We will continue to use all tools at our disposal to promote accountability for those who further destabilize conditions in the West Bank and support extremist violence. Moreover, we recognize that the West Bank's economic stability is also critical to Israeli and regional security. For that reason, the United States strongly urges that Israel extend correspondent banking services by at least 1 year to prevent economic collapse in the West Bank, which not only jeopardizes Israel's security, but also regional stability. Colleagues, we've discussed Gaza at length, and so let me simply reiterate. The United States is doing everything possible to end the war in a way that secures the release of the hostages, surges humanitarian aid to Palestinian civilians, and ensures Israel's security. The Security Council has an obligation not to let Hamas off the hook. Not after the misery, death, and destruction they sparked 13 months ago. Hamas has cynically demonstrated that it prefers the war continue, including by rejecting multiple ceasefire offers and other formulas that would bring much-needed relief to Palestinian civilians desperate for an end to the fighting. We must not cave into Hamas's demands or allow it to dictate the course of events. Rather, we must increase pressure on Hamas to implement Resolution 2735 without condition and without delay. Toward that end, the United States last week imposed additional sanctions on Hamas political leaders and fundraisers. At the same time, Israel must take more steps to facilitate the humanitarian access and the sustained delivery of aid at scale, to restore the flow of commercial goods, and to address persistent lawlessness that prevents aid from reaching Palestinians in Gaza. It's abhorrent that criminal gangs have been allowed to loot humanitarian assistance for their own ends. They are taking food and medicine out of the hands of Palestinian civilians, including children. Only after we reach a ceasefire agreement with hostage release consistent with Resolution 2735 will it be possible to chart a new path forward in Gaza that enables Palestinians to rebuild their lives free from Hamas's tyranny. As we have stressed, the UN is not the problem. Rather, it's part of the solution, and we join other Council members in recognizing the risk and sacrifices UN staff are making daily to deliver aid. It's vital that Israel and relevant UN entities find productive and proactive solutions, including on regarding UNRWA, so they can get more life-saving assistance delivered to people in need. At the same time, the United States fundamentally rejects the International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials. We have been clear that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over this matter, and we are deeply concerned by the prosecutor's rush to seek arrest warrants, as well as troubling process errors that led to this decision. Moreover, this decision does not make the pursuit of peace any easier. We have an opportunity for a political settlement that provides a better future for Israelis and Palestinians. But only if we pressure Hamas, and only if we do not waver in our commitment to a two-state solution. The United States will continue to support diplomacy on the ground and to encourage steps to alleviate the tremendous suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza who did not start this conflict and are relying on all of us to help end it. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I also thank Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi for his sobering briefing. Malta remains deeply concerned about the ongoing war in Gaza and the unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe it has fomented. Civilians continue to suffer as the prospects for peace grow ever dimmer. We deeply regret that this Council's efforts to adopt a resolution to end the hostilities were once again vetoed last week. We said it on that day, and we will say it again. The draft resolution, co-penned by the E10, represented the bare minimum of what is needed to begin to address the desperate situation on the ground. We reiterate our unequivocal demand for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire across Gaza and the broader region. We also reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other armed groups since the horrific terror attacks of 7 October. It is equally critical that a ceasefire be accompanied with unhindered and sustained humanitarian access to deliver aid at scale required to address the population's critical needs. Following the developments of recent days, as a firm and committed supporter of the ICC, Malta will abide by its obligations as a party to the Rome Statute. President, Gaza continues to be subjected to incessant bombardments by Israel. This dire situation has been exacerbated by the denial of humanitarian aid. Basic and essential food and health systems have collapsed, and widespread displacement and catastrophic living conditions are prevalent. The risk of famine in North Gaza grows with each day that humanitarian aid is denied. Malta urges Israel to lift all restrictions hindering humanitarian aid from being distributed into and throughout Gaza, and calls for the immediate restoration of humanitarian access. The forced displacement of civilians, including women and children, must end, and all efforts should focus on facilitating the return of civilians to their homes. Moreover, Malta unequivocally condemns all targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. All parties must uphold the principles of international law, including international humanitarian law. In this vein, we stress that attacks targeting humanitarian workers and UN personnel are unacceptable. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, settlement expansion, settler violence, and the dispossession of Palestinian communities continue. This further destabilizes the region, entrenches the illegal occupation, and undermines the prospect for a two-state solution. We call on Israel to reverse these actions and to respect and abide by international law. Irresponsible calls for the annexation of the West Bank by some Israeli officials and inflammatory rhetoric on the status quo of the holy sites are resurfacing, adding more fuel to the fire. Such actions would be also in violation of international law. We recall the ICJ advisory opinion of 19 July that clearly stated that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is unlawful and must end as soon as possible. Malta condemns any attempts to abrogate the 1967 agreement between Israel and UNRWA or to obstruct the agency's capacity to implement its mandate. We call upon Israel to rescind these legislative actions. The agency is irreplaceable in providing essential support to Palestinian refugees and ensuring regional stability. UNRWA is the last remaining lifeline for many Palestinians. It must be strengthened and its personnel must be protected. Without significant de-escalation and the re-establishment of a credible political framework, Israeli-Palestinian peace will remain elusive. Malta urges parties to rapidly de-escalate and fully commit to diplomacy, including on the gravely worrying situation along the Blue Line and in Lebanon. Those with influence on the parties must exert it in the direction of peace. An effective political framework must be accompanied with support for a revitalized Palestinian Authority which integrates Gaza and the West Bank and makes part of a sustainable recovery plan for Gaza. The key to a durable peace lies in the fulfillment of Palestinian aspirations for statehood and self-determination, while also ensuring robust guarantees for Israel's security. In conclusion, Madam President, Malta remains steadfast in its commitment to a credible and irreversible two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders and in line with Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. This is the only viable path to a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi on behalf of Mr. Westland for his informative updates. At the outset, Japan reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of the brutal attacks of terror by Hamas and others on October 7th last year. Since then, this Council has had numerous meetings on the Palestinian issues, including 3 within the past week. Frankly, we are running out of the words to explain the agony in Gaza, especially in the north. Recently, UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini stated Gaza is post-apocalyptic environment, a word that means after the end of the world. A situation like that is truly unthinkable. And then what next? We must bring an end to this nightmare. To do so, an immediate ceasefire and the release of all remaining hostages are urgently needed, as the E10 called for in its draft resolution last week. Japan continues to support the diplomatic efforts on the ground to conclude that deal. Meanwhile, famine is imminent, and so many displaced people are living in makeshift tents as winter approaches. Hospitals are still being attacked, and health systems are on the verge of collapse. Safe and unhindered access to humanitarian relief must be guaranteed. Civilians, including aid workers and medical personnel, must be protected. More broadly, international law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected. Any efforts to internationally block the delivery of critical life-saving assistance to the civilian population in Gaza is unacceptable. UNRWA's role has never been more crucial, but the clock is ticking on the implementation of the 2 laws that would have a devastating impact on UNRWA and those who depend on the agency. A concerted international effort is imperative to avoid that. At the same time, UNRWA should continue to take steps to ensure its neutrality. Madam President, the Middle East is facing heightened risk of full-scale regional conflict. In the shadow of Gaza, violence is unfolding in the West Bank. Daily exchanges of fire continue to across the Blue Line. Intense aerial bombardment in Lebanon, including in dense populated areas, has affected millions of innocent civilians. We renew our call for the full implementation of Resolution 1701 and fully support ongoing diplomacy to realize an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon. Madam President, the peaceful coexistence of Israel and Palestine is the only viable pathway to a safe, stable, and prosperous Middle East. However, an Israeli minister has recently made a concerning remark on plans for annexation of the West Bank. Such a plan must not be carried out. We also reject any attempt at the demographic or territorial change in the Gaza Strip, including any actions that would reduce its territory. Japan reiterates its unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution and is against any attempt which ruins the prospect for the two-state solution. In this regard, we stress the importance of unifying the Gaza Strip with the West Bank under a revitalized Palestinian Authority, and we offer our steadfast support to the reform of PA, both politically and financially. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the Deputy Special Coordinator and the Humanitarian Coordinator for the Middle East, Mohanad Hadi, for his thorough briefing on the situation in the region. The Middle East today is the best illustration of the danger that is borne by drawn-out, unresolved regional conflicts. The failure to resolve the Palestinian question for more than 70 years has caused a number of brutal wars and brought unimaginable suffering to the peoples of the region. The other day, we marked 400 days since the Arab-Israeli confrontation moved into the hot phase. And over those 400 days, the UN Security Council has not been able to fulfill its mandate for the maintenance of international peace and security, nor has it been able to play the role that is entrusted to it by the UN Charter. Throughout this time, having got carte blanche from Washington to take absolutely any actions, Israel, arrogantly ignoring the position of the international community, is knowingly worsening the situation. Since the beginning of the escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli confrontation in October 2023, in the Gaza Strip, more than 44,000 people have died, 104,000 Palestinians have been wounded. Another glaring violation of all of the norms of international law was the Israeli bombing on the eve of our meeting of the area around Kamal Adwan Hospital in the north of Gaza, as a result of which 12 medical staff, including a senior doctor, were injured. The Israeli Defense Force, since the beginning of the conflict, has been committing gross violations of IHL and is attacking civilian objects, residential buildings, schools and hospitals. And these are not accidental mistaken strikes. This is a targeted tactic. According to the assessment of UNRWA Director General Filippo Lazzarini, 80% of Gaza's territory is a high-risk area where the civilian population has been caught in a trap and is essentially live targets for Israeli soldiers. And yet, for 40 days now, the residents of Gaza have not been able to get humanitarian assistance, the deliveries of which is being held up by all means by the Israeli authorities. We know from humanitarians that in the past week alone, the Israeli authorities have obstructed 2/3 of humanitarian operations. All of this is taking place against the backdrop of the campaign of repression that West Jerusalem has unleashed against UNRWA due to strikes on the agency's objects. Since the beginning of the escalation, more than 230 staff members have been killed, and in total, the victims of Israeli attacks are 380 humanitarian workers. This is a monstrous record, the worst in modern history. By ignoring the opinion of the overwhelming majority of UN members and violating the norms of international law and the conditions of its own admission into the World Organization, Israel has adopted bills against UNRWA that prohibit the agency's activities and withdraw the UN entity's immunities and privileges. If these decisions enter into force, the last support left in Gazans' lives will collapse because in the foreseeable future, no one will be able to replace UNRWA. We once again demand that Israel observe its international legal obligations, that it not implement or that it repeal these bills. Madam President, over 5 months, the Council has not been able to take any decision on Gaza since the USA forced through Security Council Resolution 2735 in support of the so-called Biden Plan, which was based on the false assertion that Israel had consented to a deal. In fact, West Jerusalem didn't consent to any schemes, and the entire time continued to carry out its military plans and tried to impose its demands in violation of Resolution 2735. And in response, the USA only demands and continues to demand that we all put pressure on Hamas. Against this backdrop, it is telling that there are regular calls for the deportation of Palestinians from Gaza coming from the Ministers of National Security and Finances of Israel. All of this speaks to the true intentions of the Israeli authorities, who don't have a negotiated solution on their agenda. Their plan is clear: to create yet another irreversible fact on the ground, a scorched, depopulated Gaza that has been emptied of Palestinians. Last week, the Council, which for more than 30 months has not been able to demand an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire, got another opportunity to do so. The non-permanent members of the Council, led by Guyana, took the initiative to prepare a worthy draft resolution that contained both the demand for an immediate, permanent and unconditional ceasefire and also a demand for the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. But the USA again alone vetoed the draft, showing the entire world that they are not interested in the lives of Palestinian civilians nor the saving of the hostages, because if they really were driven by a desire to get them released as quickly as possible, they would have done everything they could to stop the Israeli military operation in the Gaza Strip, in which the captured Israelis are also being killed. In particular, the other day there were reports that one hostage had died and another had been seriously injured in a part of the north of the Gaza Strip that had been bombed by the Israelis. This is further confirmation that the further escalation is not going to help the hostages in any way. It is clear to all of us that their release will only be possible with an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. By vetoing the E10's draft, the USA found itself in total international isolation. Their approaches are not supported by the Middle East, nor the members of the Security Council, nor by the overwhelming majority of UN member states. Washington's stance on blocking the work of the Security Council on the Middle East remains a stain on the reputation of the outgoing US administration that it will never be able to wash off. Their indulging and playing into the hands of Israel has already led to the deaths of more than 44,000 Palestinian civilians, in large part women and children. How many more people need to die for Gaza to at last see peace? Or will the USA obstruct this until all the Palestinians have been exterminated and the question of the two-state solution falls away by itself? We would like to hope that other sensible members of the international community will have the determination to prevent that. Russia will continue to insist on the adoption of the most decisive measures to stop the bloodshed in Gaza. We stand ready to work on this matter with all rational and responsible members of the Security Council and also by working in the UN General Assembly. Madam President, the conflict in Gaza is spilling over into the region in the worst possible way, sowing chaos and destruction everywhere and threatening to drown the Middle East in blood. In Lebanon, Israel's military operation has killed more than 3,500 people. A further 15,000 people have been injured and more than 1 million have been forced to leave their homes. As in Gaza, the majority of the casualties are civilians that have fallen under the destructive tread of Israel's war machine. The key to solving the conflict in Lebanon is the full implementation by all parties of Resolution 1701 of the UN Security Council, which stipulates observing and respecting Israel's obligations to stop all offensive military operations, to withdraw its military forces from the south of Lebanon and to end the occupation of Lebanese lands, and also the provisions on the withdrawal of all Hezbollah formations to the north of the Litani River. Russia's approaches to the Middle East settlement are well known. They are based on the universally recognized international legal basis and have remained consistent and principled over many decades. We have no doubt that only a ceasefire in Lebanon and in Gaza, as well as the stabilization of the situation in the West Bank, will create the preconditions for peace talks, which would be able to bring about the long-awaited, just and lasting peace in the Middle East. It can only be based on the two-state solution that stipulates the creation of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. The experience of the past decade shows that such negotiations need to be conducted under the aegis of all key international and regional players, rather than being monopolized by individual powers that are interested exclusively in advancing their own agenda. Only then will it be possible to restore historical justice for the Palestinian people and ensure their right to self-determination. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
السيد الرئيس Madam President, at the outset, allow me to thank you for organizing this meeting. I would also like to thank Mr. Mohanad Hadi for his comprehensive briefing, which clarifies the gravity of the situation in the Middle East and depicts the need to take urgent action to ensure stability in the region and prevent further violence. The Middle East today is at a crossroads. Either it finds a final solution to its crises by upholding the rule of law and protecting rights, or might and impunity will prevail. Today, we are put to the test. Our collective work and the current international order are put to the test. Before the horrors of the systemic violations of human rights and international humanitarian law in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza, the international community cannot remain unable to find a solution that would protect the dignity of Palestinians and save their lives. Unfortunately, the hands of the Council have been tied. It is unable to meet the most basic requirements, namely an unconditional, immediate, permanent ceasefire. This raises question marks about the effectiveness of multilateralism and the point of the international law. Once again, we regret the failure by the Security Council to adopt a draft resolution tabled by the E10 last Wednesday. We therefore call upon everyone to rise up to the occasion, to allow the Security Council as the competent body in line with the UN Charter to maintain international peace and security and shoulder its legal and historic responsibilities in full. Every hour that passes without us being able to stop the Israeli killing machine breeds more suffering for all the people of Gaza. Hundreds of people are being killed and injured, including women and children. Together, we must stop the bloodshed before it kills any remaining hope for Palestinians. Madam President, the aggression by the Israeli occupier does not only target Gaza, it also targets Palestinian presence on its territories wherever they are. The goal is to implement a despicable racist project that seeks to eliminate Arab presence between the river and the sea. This is not being hidden by the Israeli occupation authorities. They are rather boasting about it. Once again, Algeria condemns the policies of the Israeli occupier, seeking to expand settlements in the West Bank and threatening to annex it in a blatant and clear violation of the international law, especially Resolution 2334. We also condemn the continued violations of Holy Al-Aqsa and Muslim and Christian holy sites in Al-Quds Al-Sharif. We call for respecting the current historic and legal status of Jerusalem and the Jordanian custodianship. We strongly condemn the growing settler terrorism against Palestinians and infringements against their property with the protection of occupation authorities. This terrorism will undoubtedly grow. Yes, it will undoubtedly grow given the continued arming of settler gangs and the decision to stop administrative arrests against them. These acts need to be condemned. They need to be sanctioned. The Security Council must impose deterrent sanctions to ensure the implementation of its resolutions, specifically because its credibility is at stake today. Madam President, in light of the paralysis at the Security Council and the crippling of its mechanisms, 2 arrest warrants were issued against officials from the occupation authorities for committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Gaza Strip. This move gives hope to Palestinians and free people around the world. Algeria stresses that this measure represents an important step and tangible progress towards ending decades of impunity and immunity for the Israeli occupier. They were not being held accountable while they continued to commit their crimes against the Palestinians, the states, and the peoples of the region. We stress the need for the international community, specifically the States Party to the ICC, to implement this decision. And once again, we call for not hindering the work of the ICC. This is another test of our belief in the current rules-based international order and our attachment to the rule of law. Any attempt to protect occupation officials will give them green light to continue to destabilize the Middle East. It will be an implicit approval for the expansion of the conflict. The silence by the international community vis-à-vis the crimes of the Israeli occupier and the support by some have emboldened it to continue its aggression and target Lebanon and Syria. Today, they are threatening Iraq. Israeli aggression needs to be stopped and an end needs to be put to its arrogance in the region. Madam President, in conclusion, as we are days away from celebrating the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, we stress that the best way to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Palestine is to stop the genocide against them, is to put an end to any attempt to eliminate their national project by allowing them to practice and enjoy their inalienable legitimate rights to self-determination, to establish an independent Palestinian state with Al-Quds al-Sharif as a capital. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, thank you for organizing today's briefing. I also thank Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi for his sobering briefing. In the last week, this Council has met on 3 occasions to consider the situation in Gaza. But there appears to be no points of hope that the sun is setting on this war. Instead, to date, the sun has set on the lives of more than 44,000 persons in Gaza, and may set on the lives of hundreds of thousands more who are confronted with mounting starvation, injury, and disease if action is not taken to end the suffering. Regrettably, the resolution of the elected 10 members of this Council that sought to take such action was vetoed last week. Guyana reiterates its call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire as the first and most fundamental step to changing the situation on the ground for the numerous civilians in Gaza who have been experiencing unprecedented levels of violence and deprivation. Madam President, Guyana is deeply concerned that civilians in North Gaza continue to be besieged and are consequently facing diminishing conditions for survival. Bakeries and kitchens have shut down. Nutrition support has been suspended, and the refueling of water and sanitation facilities remains restricted. In this context, we have noted that all attempts by the United Nations to support people in North Gaza have been denied or impeded. For example, between the 1st and 18th of November, 27 out of 31 coordination requests by the UN to access the besieged areas were denied, and the remaining 4 were initially approved, but then impeded on the ground. Madam President, these developments come on the heels of the recent report by the IPC's Famine Review Committee that famine is likely occurring in North Gaza or imminent. Our responsibility as a Council is mounting in the face of this tragedy. We must act to bring the suffering to an immediate and permanent end. Madam President, the situation in the Gaza Strip as a whole is equally concerning. Humanitarian operations across Gaza continue to be severely affected by access restrictions, and there is little or no cooperation from the Israeli side with the UN and humanitarian partners trying to address the unprecedented suffering. This is consistent with the pattern we have seen since the start of this war, to inflict pain on the Palestinian people and deny them the means of easing that pain. This is the reason we continue to witness systematic attacks on healthcare infrastructure and continued disregard for deconfliction and coordination mechanisms. Guyana calls on Israel and all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law, and to prioritize the well-being and protection of civilians. Madam President, the situation of Palestinians in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, also continues to deteriorate. The worrying statistics include the killing by the Israeli forces of an average of 3 Palestinian children per week in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, since 7 October 2023, a 400% increase in such killings compared to the first 9 months of 2023. The displacement of hundreds of Palestinians in the West Bank due to settler violence, intimidation and harassment, and school dropouts attributable to rising access restrictions. Shocking levels of barbarism characterize these illegalities, and even children are not spared such acts. Madam President, we have heard repeated arguments about Israel's right to defend itself in response to Hamas's attack of 7th October, attacks which Guyana have repeatedly condemned. But let's be clear, while fully respecting every state's right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter, the Charter is also clear on how that right is to be exercised. It is neither absolute nor limitless. It is governed by clear rules under international law, and it's Israel's complete disregard for international law that makes what is taking place in Gaza so fundamentally wrong. In what scenario does a state's defense depend on the brutal killing of over 13,000 children? No UN member state can invoke Article 51 of the Charter to defend killing, maiming, and starving innocent women and children. In the context of this appalling situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, Guyana underlines the following four key messages. First, the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories has brought nothing but decades of pain and destruction to the Palestinian people, though it continues to be couched as a necessity for Israel's security. On the contrary, the occupation has led to insecurity and instability for both Palestinians and Israelis, and the Middle East as a whole. Guyana therefore recalls the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice on the illegality of the continued Israeli presence in the occupied Palestinian territories, and emphasizes Israel's obligation to bring that occupation to a swift end. Second, the Security Council has a charter responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and a mandate to address threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. Guyana therefore calls on all members of the Council to consider how this mandate ought to be applied in the current conflict, bearing in mind the heavy toll that the war continues to have on civilians. Third, the need for accountability cannot be overemphasized. The international rule of law must be consistently applied across contexts and cannot only be strenuously defended when a particular set of people are the victims. The law must be blind to all distinctions. Fourth, the two-state solution is still the only just path to ending the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the prospects for achieving it are dwindling with every day that the atrocities against the Palestinian people continue with impunity. It is our collective responsibility to chart a path towards implementation of the two-state solution as the only way for the Palestinian people to exercise their right to self-determination. Guyana is committed to working with this Council to address all of these concerns in line with the scope provided by the Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, we thank United Kingdom's President for convening this briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our appreciation to Mr. Mohammed Hadi, Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident Humanitarian Coordinator for the Middle East process, for his important briefing. Madam President, from the briefing by the Deputy Special Coordinator, it's clear that the situation in Gaza in the occupied Palestinian territory remains a matter of great concern. So far, diplomatic efforts have not been successful in bringing about a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The geopolitical complexities and add layers of difficulty that make it a profoundly challenging environment for peace, stability. The humanitarian situation remains critical, with civilians bearing the brunt of ongoing relentless war. The United Nations has reported a number of incidents involving settlers and affecting hundreds of Palestinians, including a high number of attacks that resulted in casualties and property damage. In addition to attacks, reports indicate that forced demolition persists, including destruction of Palestinian agricultural resources in the East Jerusalem, in Suez and Rafah. We strongly condemn these heinous acts. We underscore the urgent need for all involved parties to strictly abide by international law and the importance of upholding justice and human rights. We hold the view that lasting peace and security in the Middle East requires more than just a military intervention and a crude use of force. Madam President, the recent inability of Security Council to present a united stand to address the critical issue of the Middle East is merely troubling. However, we continue to believe that the Council's role remains crucial in the pursuit of peace and stability in the Middle East, including the resolution of the Palestinian issue. In this connection, Madam President, we consider that the previous relevant resolution, Security Council resolution on the matter must be observed and implemented. Despite the current challenges, we advocate more diplomatic actions, genuine and constructive dialogue, and a unified action within the Council as the best path towards peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. There is an urgent need for renewed and intensified efforts to find a sustainable political solution to address the root causes of the conflict. It is imperative a solution that respects the rights and aspirations of all peoples in the region. In this connection, we urge for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. We also urge an immediate and conditional release of hostages and the free and unhindered flow of humanitarian aid, in line with Security Council resolution we have so far adopted, including Resolution 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. Ensuring a future of safety, dignity, and well-being of both peoples of Israel and Palestine through a two-state solution must be our vital and shared objective. Both people deserve to live side by side in peace, security, and prosperity. Efforts to forcibly impose one-state solution will not bring peace, security, and stability, neither to Israel nor to Palestine. A two-state solution is an essential goal to be attained. It requires a sustained diplomatic efforts, mutual understanding, and a committed to purpose and principles of United Nations Charter. To conclude, Madam President, we strongly believe that peace, stability in the Middle East is essential for both regional and global security and development. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to thank the Office of the Special Coordinator for the extremely dark report that we received this morning, and as usual, I want to thank him and reiterate the support of my country for his work for the United Nations and all its agencies. 5 days have passed since the last session of this Council on this topic. Our message has not changed. Ecuador reiterates the need for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages, and the immediate implementation of the 4 resolutions already adopted by the Security Council, 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. At almost 14 months since the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October of 2023, which was the immediate cause of the war in Gaza, Ecuador once again wishes to condemn them unequivocally. Madam President, my country deplores all attacks against civilians, against critical infrastructure and civilian property, as well as any violence and hostilities against civilians. My country recalls that all the parties must fulfill their obligations pursuant to international law, including international humanitarian law, international human rights law. Not to do so incurs grave responsibilities. Due process and accountability are also necessary. It's urgent to stop the spiral of violence that is spreading across the region, as well as to protect and support those who are working to minimize the suffering and help the victims of the war in line with Resolution 2730 of this Council. It's also urgent, and with this I would like to conclude, to take concrete steps towards a political, definitive and just solution, a peaceful solution that allows for the coexistence of 2 states, Palestine and Israel, with security and dignity for both peoples. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Madam President, thank you for convening this briefing on the situation in the Middle East. I would also like to thank the Deputy Special Coordinator, Mr. Mohanad Hadi, for his briefing on behalf of Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland. Through you, Switzerland pays tribute to the central role of the UN for peace, stability, and humanitarian aid in the region. The Secretary General, his senior representatives, and the UN agencies must be able to do their job, talk to all parties without hindrance, and help all those in need. On this International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, Switzerland reiterates its sympathy and support for the women and girls who are victims of violence in this conflict, particularly sexual violence. Such violence, attested to by the UN during the acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas on October 7, 2023, constitutes serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and may constitute war crimes or even crimes against humanity. We are also deeply concerned by reports of sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinians in places of detention, during raids on homes and at checkpoints. In Gaza, the catastrophic humanitarian situation and the breakdown of law and order mean that women play an essential role in the response to the crisis. However, this also exposes them to a lack of privacy, with all its consequences for their hygiene and physical integrity. The suffering and dehumanization of all the victims of this conflict must come to an end. Switzerland reiterates its call for a ceasefire and the release of hostages, which must be unconditional and immediate. We deeply regret the non-adoption last Wednesday of the draft resolution of the elected members coordinated by Guyana, which had explicitly requested that. While the search for a council consensus for firm action must continue, the fundamental principles of international law, including international humanitarian law, have been agreed upon for decades decades. Obligations in this area apply in armed conflicts in all circumstances. These obligations include the obligation to treat all persons deprived of their liberty in connection with the conflict humanely, the prohibition on taking people hostage, the obligation to facilitate rapid, safe and unhindered access for humanitarian aid, and the obligation to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, including UN personnel and premises. Moreover, as an occupying power, Israel has an obligation to ensure, to the best of its ability, that the basic needs of the Palestinian population are met. Switzerland supports any action that ensures accountability for serious violations of international law, including the acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas on October 7, 2023, and any other violations committed by the parties during the hostilities in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. With regard to the arrest warrants issued on November 21st by the International Criminal Court, Switzerland stresses that the independence of this judicial institution must be respected. It deplores all forms of threats or measures taken against the court, its officials, and those who cooperate with it. Madam President, Switzerland rejects all declarations aimed at annexing territory, developing new settlements, and taking measures that would introduce permanent changes, notably demographic and administrative changes in the occupied territory, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We recall that the Israeli occupation, which has lasted since 1967, is illegal. Together with the settlers' attacks, threats, and intimidation, it constitutes a major obstacle to the solution of two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. The destructive logic that prevails today must be countered by concrete efforts for peace, such as the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution, launched here in New York in September. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi for his briefing. Last Wednesday, because of the lone U.S. veto, the Council's efforts to push for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza were once again thwarted. In the days that followed, hundreds more civilians lost their lives in Gaza. With each passing day, the situation is worsening, moving into an even more dangerous direction. We saw that on November 21st, in an early morning Israeli attack of a residential area in Beit Lahia, North Gaza, dozens of women and children were killed in their sleep. On the 23rd, Israel again attacked the Kamal Adwan Hospital in North Gaza, causing further serious damage to the only remaining medical facility in the north. And newborn babies lost their oxygen supply and went into cardiac arrest. On the 24th, Israel issued an emergency evacuation order for the eastern part of Gaza City, and a large number of people were forced to flee overnight, and they were being displaced yet again. Also, in the past few days, Israel continued its indiscriminate bombardment of south and east Lebanon, repeatedly striking the densely populated urban area of Beirut, leveling large areas of villages and leaving hundreds of innocent civilians in flames. Accompanied by the paralysis of the Council is the war machine going at full throttle. The facts show that the Council's continued delay will mean even greater destruction and civilian casualties. The Council cannot afford to pause and wait. It must seize every minute and take all necessary actions at the earliest opportunity. First, it must promote an immediate, unconditional, and lasting ceasefire. A ceasefire is an essential precondition for saving lives and cannot be linked to any issue. Insisting on preconditions
conditions for a ceasefire means condoning the continued killing of innocent civilians and giving the green light for prolonging the war. Second, barriers to humanitarian access must be removed. The fulfillment of international humanitarian law is a non-negotiable obligation and cannot be a bargaining chip. Israel must lift all restrictions on access, cease the implementation of and revoke its bill against UNRWA, and effectively guarantee the access and safe distribution at scale of humanitarian supplies throughout Gaza. Third, unilateral actions that undermine the basis of the two-state solution must be rejected. The implementation of the two-state solution on the basis of international law and Security Council resolutions is the only viable way to resolve the Palestinian question. In order to preserve the prospects for the two-state solution, the barbaric expansion of illegal settlements in the West Bank must be halted, and any dangerous attempt to annex the West Bank must be rejected. The future arrangements for Gaza must be premised on an Israeli withdrawal and be decided by the Palestinian people through their own consultations. Any change in Gaza's demographics and territory is unacceptable. Fourth, a wider regional conflict must be stopped. The situation in the Middle East is already precarious, and Israel must abandon its obsession with the use of force and cease its aggression and provocative adventures against Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and other countries. And UNIFIL is authorized to carry out its mandate in accordance with the Council resolutions, and all parties should respect and guarantee the safety of UNIFIL personnel and facilities. President, as has been said by the Deputy Special Coordinator, the Gaza conflict is the biggest stress test the United Nations has ever faced in the Middle East. In our view, this stress test is the first and foremost a test for the Council members. It tests their ability to save lives and maintain peace. It tests their determination to uphold international rule of law, fairness, and justice. It tests their willingness to safeguard the authority of the Council's mechanisms and resolutions. So far, due to the negative attitude of some countries, the Council's performance did not pass the test. We call on the individual country to face up squarely to its responsibilities and support the Council in using all options in the toolbox to take further action so as to achieve an immediate ceasefire and restore peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mohamed Hadi, Deputy Special Coordinator, for his briefing. The continuation of the conflict in the Gaza Strip, which has gone on for more than a year now, is horrendous for civilians who are forced to accept a life they really do not deserve. Despite this unfortunate scenario, the end of the conflict is not in sight, especially as the parties are not adhering to their responsibilities outlined in international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. It's saddening to note that the laws designed to inject some semblance of humanity into conflict situations are outrightly disregarded and flagrantly violated. Additionally, the resolutions passed by this Council, including 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735, have not been implemented, and other efforts to clearly address the situation, including efforts to institute an immediate and unconditional ceasefire just to save lives, have not been fruitful. This conflict has brought a high humanitarian cost, with increased civilian casualties and massive destruction in the Gaza Strip. We have witnessed a dangerous progression with civilians and civilian objects particularly targeted. The principles of humanity, distinction, precaution, and proportionality, repeated incalculably in this chamber by various Council members, have not been respected since the start of the conflict. Madam President, as stated by OCHA, the current siege on the northern Gaza Strip has lasted for more than 40 days, and conditions for survival diminish by the day. Attempts by humanitarian workers to assist the people in the north are frequently denied or impeded. Bakeries and kitchens are not operational, and civilians cannot access the nutritional support they need to remain healthy. Water and sanitation services also remain restricted. Reports from the West Bank are also alarming due to airstrikes, raids, and persistent settler violence, leading to displacement, intimidation, and harassment. Access restrictions in certain areas are affecting children who are compelled to forego their educational development because the opportunities simply do not exist. Similar tensions in the region continue to escalate as fighting between Israel and Hezbollah intensifies in Lebanon. In this regard, we are appalled by the wounding of 4 UNIFIL peacekeepers as a result of Hezbollah rocket fire. We also deeply regret the deaths of the hospital director and 5 paramedics a few days ago. We welcome ongoing diplomatic efforts to achieve a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. What we are witnessing in the Gaza Strip and the Middle East region is not just unacceptable, but it's a reflection of a deeper systemic acceptance of injustice, oppression, and impunity. Thus, to end this tragedy and the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, Sierra Leone reiterates its call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, which, in our considered view, will create the pathway not only to save lives, but also for meaningful diplomatic engagement to take place. We also reiterate that all hostages held by Hamas since October 2023 are to be immediately and unconditionally released. We further call for unimpeded humanitarian assistance of food, medicine, medical equipment, and other vital supplies to civilians in need, and request that commodities needed to assist humanitarian workers and ensure hospitals and other critical infrastructures are operational be made available. We acknowledge that a long-term settlement of this conflict will require a political situation to be agreed through a negotiated settlement. Therefore, we look forward to the urgent resumption of the diplomatic negotiations facilitated by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, and appeal to conflicting parties to exercise political courage and willingness to engage. In closing, we will continue to stress the need for accountability and justice for the victims of atrocities and all breaches of international law through appropriate international legal mechanisms. In this light, we call for adherence to the decisions of the International Court of Justice on the conflict in Gaza. It's our fervent hope that now more than ever, the two-state solution can be realized with Israel and Palestine living side by side as neighbors in peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, it is urgent to obtain an immediate and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. France will continue to work towards that end. France calls on Israel to ensure the protection of all civilians and all civilian infrastructure. Any forced displacement of population represents a grave violation of international law. The obstacles put up for the delivery of humanitarian aid to the north of Gaza must be lifted immediately. All crossing points must be open and the necessary aid delivered to the civilian populations throughout the Gaza Strip. In the face of the absolute humanitarian urgency, UN agencies play an essential role, including UNRWA. France has condemned the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October of 2023 and recalls its unwavering support for the security of Israel and continues to demand the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. The resolutions of the Security Council must be fully implemented. It's also important to work towards a two-state solution on the basis of agreed parameters. Security guarantees are necessary for Israelis, and we have to work for the creation of an independent, viable, and contiguous state for the Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority must be mobilized to achieve those roles. In Lebanon, the war must end as quickly as possible. The solution is clear: implement fully Resolution 1701. Its implementation since 2006 has been insufficient. This framework is recognized by all. It's more relevant than ever. We have to ensure that Resolution 1701 is respected by all. UNIFIL plays a key role in this. Its action must be made more robust while retaining its mandate. France condemns all attacks against the security of UNIFIL. It must be able to exercise its freedom of movement to implement its mandate. Finally, the Lebanese government must continue deployment of its armed forces to the south of Litani. The conference in Paris on the 24th of October made it possible to raise $200 million for this end, in addition to the $800 million for humanitarian aid. And it's in this spirit that France will remain engaged and continue its contacts with all the different actors to achieve a ceasefire and lasting stability along the blue line. Thank you.
The representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, President. I wish to begin by thanking Deputy Coordinator Hadi for his briefing. Madam President, since day one of the war in Gaza, there was one common denominator to all our statements in this organization's chamber. More than a year after the terrorist attack of Hamas and ensuing war in Gaza, the tone of our statements might have changed, but the call we had since the beginning stays the same. It is our call for the respect of international law. It is our firm belief that in a world of clashing interests, international law represents a safety net. International law is not a menu to choose from, and it should know no double standards. We must all stand by it, and we must all act based on its guidance. And to answer a question posed to us last week, there is only one set of international law for everyone. We have met many times throughout this war, and while discussing complex war or individual incidents, all members of this Council have been clear all along. International law matters. It matters how the world is conducted. The protection of civilians matters. Accountability matters. Every country, including Israel, and every entity, including Hamas, must be held accountable to these international legal standards. Slovenia underlines the need for accountability for all grave violations and abuses of international law in all situations. Without accountability, any peace we are pursuing will remain illusory. Accountability must be a cornerstone of sustainable peace and closure that people in the region will desperately need. As we have made it clear in the case of the International Court of Justice, we want to make it clear in relation to the International Criminal Court. Slovenia is a long-standing supporter of the work of the International Criminal Court, its independence, and its integrity. Full respect of international law must include respect for decisions and judicial advice of international courts and tribunals, including arrest warrants. We build a system to serve humanity. Madam President, we are alarmed by the continued deterioration of the situation in the Middle East. In the West Bank, airstrikes, raids, and operations continue. We are appalled by the number of children killed in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, every week since October 7th last year. Settler violence, restrictions, and demolitions further compound the dire situation. And let me also add to that Slovenia rejects any idea or plan to annex the West Bank. International law is clear on that. People in Gaza are facing an apocalyptic situation in the north, which has been besieged. Hunger is spreading, aid is restricted. Winter is coming and insecurity could bring the humanitarian operation in Gaza to a standstill. We deplore the looting of humanitarian aid convoys and underline the responsibility of parties to the conflict to ensure aid reaches people in need. Slovenia highlights the vital role of UNRWA in providing assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. Madam President, today we mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. We must highlight the dire situation of all women and girls in Gaza, including Israeli women held hostage, who continue to be exposed to heightened risk of gender-based violence. Displacement, overcrowding, and lack of privacy in temporary shelters deprive women and girls in Gaza of safe spaces, rendering them more vulnerable to violence and abuse. Madam President, when meetings end and lights go off in this chamber, our work only ends if we manage to give people on the ground hope for a better tomorrow. As the Secretary General said some weeks ago, the only certainty people in Gaza have is that tomorrow will be worse. This seems to also be the case for the remaining hostages. So our work cannot stop here. We must do more. We must achieve an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. This Council must act decisively and give people on the ground hope for a better tomorrow. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Deputy Special Coordinator Hadi for his briefing. Madam President, 1 week ago, the Security Council received a briefing calling for the urgent need for an immediate ceasefire and the release of hostages in Gaza. Today, we have received another sobering briefing, which gives us a strong sense of deja vu. Since October of last year, the Security Council has held numerous meetings with countless briefings. For more than 13 months, we have experienced in this chamber endless deja vu. However, in the repetition of meetings, we are also able to identify a clear tendency, the voice of the international community, to end the bloodshed. Last week, the 10 elected members of the Security Council co-penned a draft resolution demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, in parallel with an immediate and unconditional release of hostages. These 10 members of the Council, all regionally, politically, and culturally different from each other, shared the same principled voice, demonstrating the common demand of the international community. Thus, we believe that even though the draft resolution was not adopted, the message that we collectively strive to deliver has in fact been communicated to the parties to the conflict. Madam President, in besieged northern Gaza, tens of thousands of civilians have been facing diminishing conditions for survival, which OCHA has described as a direct consequence of Israel's blocking of aid. Israel's ban of commercial imports, as well as increased looting due to total collapse of law and order, are further pushing the entire Gaza Strip into chaos and the risk of famine. All across Gaza, airstrikes go on. Not only Gaza, but the wider region, including the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria, remains on the precipice as well. Hezbollah is increasing its rocket attacks against Israeli population centers. And in Gaza, Israeli attacks against the hospitals and shelters are still ongoing. Particularly, the rest of the world was appalled over the weekend by graphic images broadcasted through media of the bombardment of entire residential buildings in Beirut, some of which were carried out without any evacuation orders after midnight. It is beyond our imagination how such incidents can be repeated in the 21st century, when international law, including international humanitarian law, should guide us. We hope that the deal for a ceasefire across the blue line can be finalized at the earliest time possible. We would also like to see hopeful news toward a crucial ceasefire in Gaza. On the other hand, we will not forget the Israeli hostages still brutally held in Gaza, and we are heartbroken to hear over the weekend that one female hostage was announced dead in captivity. If Hamas truly wants the war to end, the remaining hostages must be released with no conditions. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking Deputy Special Coordinator Hardy for his briefing and welcome Special Coordinator Wennesland. Perhaps you could say a few words at the end of the meeting, Special Coordinator. Colleagues, I'd like to make 3 points. First, the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic and unacceptable. Famine is likely imminent in some areas, and the unthinkable hardship that millions of civilians, including children, are already facing in Gaza is set to get even worse as winter continues. As my Foreign Secretary reiterated last Monday to this Council, there is no excuse for Israeli restrictions on humanitarian aid. We need much better protection of civilians in Gaza, a huge surge in aid, and for the UN and humanitarians to be able to operate in safety. An immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the immediate release of hostages is the best way to achieve this. Second, as we have repeatedly said, the UNRWA bills that Israel's Knesset has passed are gravely concerning and risk jeopardizing the entire international humanitarian response in Gaza and delivery of essential health and education services in the West Bank. UNRWA is indispensable. No other agency can get aid into Gaza on the scale needed or replace its mandate to serve Palestinian refugees. Israel must ensure that UNRWA can continue its vital operations. Third, we remain deeply concerned by instability in the West Bank. The economic situation is dire. We urge the government of Israel to extend correspondent banking relations for at least 1 year, to immediately release withheld clearance revenues, and to stop settlement expansion on Palestinian land, which is illegal under international law. The rate of expansion is unprecedented, and it undermines stability and the prospects for peace. We have announced 3 tranches of sanctions targeting illegal settler outposts and organizations that have supported and sponsored violence against communities in the West Bank. Palestinians must be able to live without fear of violence or intimidation. Colleagues, we must continue to work together to end the wars in Gaza and Lebanon, to secure the release of all the hostages who are living in unimaginable horror, and to stop the suffering of civilians. Too many people have lost their lives. The region needs a lasting peace with a 2-state solution at its core. I now resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this meeting and thank Mr. Muhannad Hadi for his presentation, yet again conveying the gravity of the situation in this moment. Madam President, we have spoken many times of transforming the Middle East through peace. This war, this genocide, is transforming the Middle East for generations to come, with the gravest implications for our region and the world. We say once again that this fire will devour everything on its path if it is not urgently stopped. This bloodshed, this inhumanity, has and will have devastating consequences, some we can all foresee, some we can barely imagine. Madam President, every state presented in these United Nations has a decisive choice to make, whether to defend the rule of international law and the common institutions of humankind, or to defend the massacres perpetrated by this Israeli government. The choice seems quite simple, but it seems a few politicians around the world have difficulties making the right choice regardless how evident it is. We demand them to stop playing political games with our people's life. Our children should not be sacrificed for the sake of your political calculations and ambitions, nor should they be left as prey to political ideologies blinded by hate and fanaticism. These politicians are the ones who attack judges in order to shield war criminals, who justify mass indiscriminate killing and starvation of an entire civilian population. They are the ones who cynically explain that settlers should be supported and that the indigenous people should be forcibly removed. They are the ones who consider that rights vary according to nationality or faith. To them we say, if you are not able to be on the right side, then at least step aside. No, Netanyahu is not Dreyfus. Netanyahu is not Dreyfus, as the arrest warrant against him has nothing to do with his faith and everything to do with his crimes. Stand up to his divergence and distortions, to his smearing, his threats, and his attacks. The ICC, the ICJ, this Council, and the General Assembly, the Secretary General, and the United Nations are not anti-Semitic. I repeat, they are not anti-Semitic. And Netanyahu's efforts to frame efforts to uphold international law as anti-Semitic must be firmly rebuked. No one should accept such rhetoric, and no one should shy away from taking every step necessary to advance accountability, freedom, and peace. No one should be deterred by the Israeli government's bullying and blackmail. You should not be deterred by the Israeli government's lies and crimes. The Israeli government should be the one to be deterred by your ability and insistence to uphold the law and the truth. You must act now to restore primacy to international law, to the humanitarian and human rights laws that Israel is shredding to the detriment of all. Madam President, Palestinians in Gaza are bracing for another winter as they live in makeshift tents, besieged and bombed, without any infrastructure to sustain life, amidst all the destruction and death, and while famine has made its way into what remains of their lives. How much more suffering must they endure? Their agony must be brought to an end, and life and hope must be restored. Madam President, Israel's war machine must be stopped in Palestine and in Lebanon. It is sowing the conditions of insecurity and hatred for decades. What our region needs is not more wars, but a just and lasting peace. What our region needs is not more occupation and annexation, but respect for the right of peoples to self-determination and sovereignty, and upholding the universal prohibition of the acquisition of land by force. This Israeli government has its plan, the general's plan in Gaza and the settlers' plan in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. These plans are the prolongation of the dispossession and displacement of the Palestinian people over decades, with the certainty of more misery and more death if they refuse. What is the international community's plan? What is your plan, the mighty Security Council? It is enshrined in the UN Charter. That's what should be your plan. UN resolutions and ICJ rulings. However, it requires that decisive measures to be taken to uphold it, to implement this plan, to take it beyond words into deeds, to stop Israeli airplanes, tanks, and bulldozers, to save the millions of children, women, and men whose lives are imperiled, and to chart an irreversible pathway to freedom and justice, the only way to achieve shared peace and security. That is the plan. That should be your plan. Do not allow a solvable political conflict to be transformed into an eternal religious conflict. Don't allow that to happen. This would have terrible, unimaginable consequences for our region and the world. The fate of our region is being determined in Gaza. The fate of our region is being determined in Gaza. And if the horrors continue, it is easy to foresee what that fate would be. Either Gaza becomes the graveyard of international law or the land of its resurrection. The choice is simple and clear, and it is yours. The Israeli government expects the Palestinian people to surrender. We will never surrender. Your governments to surrender. The choice is yours. The UN to surrender. The UN should never surrender. International courts to surrender. They should not surrender. And to betray every principle humanity has ever pledged to uphold and every rule humankind has enacted. Surrender is not an option. Keep dreaming. Surrender will never be an option. Freedom will not be surrendering. The Palestinian people will not surrender. We will continue our struggle for freedom and to put an end to this illegal occupation, as the International Court of Justice has articulated. Surrender is not an option. We need to collectively fight back with every legitimate tool at hand to change history's trajectory, to save lives, and all lives, not the lives in your mind, all lives, to uphold the law, to achieve freedom, justice, and peace. As we approach the commemoration once more of the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, which we will commemorate tomorrow with the presence of your participation of the Security Council through Madam President. We appeal to you to uphold your commitments, your responsibilities, your obligations to act now to protect civilian lives, to bring an end to this abhorrent illegal situation, and to end the historic injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, colleagues, members of the Security Council.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I would like to ask Mr. Mansour, when will you address Hamas in your speeches? When you will actually speak about the problem of the Palestinian people? You blame us on everything, but you never mention Hamas. It's a different world that you live. But we know what is the problem. We know why we are sitting here every week, because of Hamas. Madam President, first I must state that the State of Israel is deeply shocked and profoundly saddened by the monstrous kidnapping and murder of Chabad Rabbi Tzvi Kogen this past weekend in the UAE. Israel will use all means available against those responsible for this barbaric act and those who orchestrated it. None will escape justice. I greatly appreciate the cooperation of the UAE in investigating this murder. We will strengthen the ties between us in the face of attempts by the axis of evil to undermine those ties. Also, I would like to mention that we are moving towards a ceasefire with Lebanon. However, at the same time, Hezbollah launched over 500 rockets at millions of Israeli citizens just 24 hours ago, over the last weekend. 500 rockets rained down on innocent families, schools, and homes, leaving millions of civilians scrambling for shelter. Iran's proxy attempts the mass murder of Israeli daily. How many more rockets must be launched before this council faces the reality of who the true aggressors are? Madam President, last week the International Criminal Court has severely weakened our international system, its laws, its norms, and most importantly, its legitimacy, more so than at any other time since the Second World War. It decided to issue arrest warrants against a democratically elected leader of a law-abiding state, Prime Minister Netanyahu and our former Defense Minister Gallant, for acting in defense of Israel following the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. All the while, Hamas still holds 101 of our people hostage. The very fact that the ICC thought it appropriate to issue arrest warrants for a democratically elected leader alongside an arch-terrorist responsible for the October 7 massacre is a mockery, a circus, an insult to the victims of October 7 and the victims of real war crimes committed around the world. The ICC has become the International Circus Court. The legal issues surrounding the warrants are glaring. Israel is not a member of the court, nor a party to the Rome Statute. Yet the ICC shamelessly claims jurisdiction, blatantly bending its mandate to serve the political agendas of its prosecutors. This is not justice. It is diplomatic terrorism. The harm caused to the international legal system will never be repaired. They have loudly and proudly declared that they are not impartial, that they will act based on the biased political agendas of its prosecutors, that they have absolutely no interest in justice. The ICC was established to uphold principles of justice, accountability, and the rule of law. Instead, it has surrendered to the most barbaric terrorists on the face of the planet. It has reduced itself to a political tool used against democracies, while turning a blind eye to the atrocities of the world's worst regimes. Last September, I spoke of the diplomatic terrorism which has been weaponized against the people of Israel. This is that diplomatic terrorism at its most dangerous. It is not about enforcing international law, it is about distorting it. Madam President, esteemed member of this Council, consider the world we now inhabit. Please take a moment to look what's happening. Bashar al-Assad remains in power after the deaths of over 500,000 Syrians during a brutal civil war. Ayatollah Khamenei oversees the Islamic regime in Iran that imprisons, tortures, and murders tens of thousands of its own citizens while funding global terrorism. Conflicts rage across the globe, in Ukraine, Sudan, Afghanistan, and countless others. Yet, the ICC's focus is on the leader of the only democracy in the Middle East, charged with the so-called crime of protecting its people from Hamas, the terrorists who burned families alive, raped women in their homes, and kidnapped over 200 to their terror dungeons. Again, I must remind you all that many of the hostages are citizens of your countries, United States, United Kingdom, France, and Russia. Each of you have citizens held hostage. We are fighting to bring them home. Make no mistake, this is not just an attack on Israel. It is an attack on every nation that values its sovereignty, that dares to act in defense of its people, that seeks to protect its citizens from harm. Today the target is Israel. Tomorrow it will be one of you. Diplomatic terrorism spares no one. It poisons every institution it touches, undermines every moral principle, and emboldens those who seek to destroy peace and stability. This is why all decent nations and every moral person in the world must unequivocally reject this injustice. Remaining silent in the face of such distortion of international law is to encourage the end of the global principles we hold dear. It is to abandon the ideals that bind us free and sovereign nations. Yet the international community appears allergic to meaningful action. While the world watches its most sacred institutions lose their legitimacy, we sit here and endlessly debate the slander against Israel. Week after week, we listen to representatives villainizing Israel and rallying their allies against us, not to propose solutions or to build peace, but to manipulate the truth to attack Israel. It was only a matter of time before this poison infected not just the halls of the United Nations, but the supposed purity of international courts. This is the natural evolution of diplomatic terrorism, a campaign that destroys every institution it touches. Mr. Mansour, I listened carefully to your speeches. In all of them, I hear condemnations after condemnations of Israel, justifications of Hamas, and accusations without basis. What I do not hear is any tangible suggestion to improve Palestinian lives. If you truly cared about your own people, you would be here with solutions, with plans for cooperation, with calls for peace. Instead, you come with venom and blame. Because for you, this is not about bettering Palestinian lives, it is about destroying Israeli ones. But the Palestinian delegation is not alone in its hypocrisy. Algeria's actions or inactions speak volumes. While nations across the Arab world take meaningful steps to assist Gazans, Algeria does nothing. No aid, no coordination, just empty condemnations, empty threats, and empty words. After all, this is the same Algeria, ranked 164th in economic freedom, 140 out of 146 for gender equality, all with an astonishing 3.6 out of 10 score on the Democracy Index. This is the same Algeria which told its prominent Jewish population, before you expel them, to choose between, and I quote, the suitcase or the coffin. It would be bad enough if you offered words without any action, but the hypocrisy is unbearable. With the state of human rights and respect for human values in your country, how dare you sit here and posture as you do? Madam President, the ICC's actions and the venom we hear in this chamber are symptoms of a larger disease, the destruction of international norms by diplomatic terrorism, a world where aggressors are emboldened, defenders are villainized, and justice is a tool of convenience in a world on the edge of chaos. Last week, this Council almost made a similar historic mistake with its one-sided ceasefire resolution that abandoned the hostages. The path we are now on sets an extremely dangerous precedent. Diplomatic terrorism must be called out and confronted. We cannot allow the twisting of laws and the distortion of institutions to continue unchecked. Today, the world and the UN marks the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. Rather than advocating for the release of the 13 women being held by Hamas rapists, we must instead combat diplomatic terrorism. Liri, Karina, Shiri, Agam, Daniela, Judy, Romy, Inbar, Ofra, Neama, Doron, Arbel, and Emily. We will never forget you, never abandon you, and we will never stop fighting for your release. Israel will not be intimidated. We will not be deterred. We will defend our people. We will speak out for the hostages and their loved ones, and we will call out hypocrisy wherever it rears its head. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. In accordance with Rule 39, the representative of Algeria has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I asked for the floor to respond to some allegations that I will not even stoop down as low to respond to. This was exploited by the that representative who is speaking a language that is immoral. I will not even be responding to allegations by some that are not even humane.
A response to someone who's bloodthirsty and who kills women and children does not deserve to be made at this table. A response to a person who everyone here in headquarters and around the world is witnessing a genocide perpetrated against a population that is defenseless and that continues to hold fast to the hope of international intervention, and certainly does not deserve to have a voice here at the table. And they deserve to have a voice at this table and as an independent state in the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. Colleagues, can I just remind that this is an official meeting of the Security Council and all participants are expected to observe appropriate standards of tone and conduct. The permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
I'm terribly sorry, Madam President, for taking the floor again. But I think a representative of an occupying power that has his government and his army killed more than 44,000 Palestinian civilians and possibly 10,000 more under the rubble, and injured more than 100,000 Palestinian civilians. Most of them are women and children. Does he really has the credentials or the credibility to speak about the Palestinian people and his concerns about them? He represents a government, the head of it is a war criminal in which a warrant of arrest by a very important court, global court, the ICC, has issued that warrant of arrest for him. And the entire membership of the ICC, including all members of the European Union, all the states who are friends of the State of Israel, announced in the name of Mr. Borrell, their foreign minister, that all member states of the European Union, member of the ICC, and others said that they honor and respect the independence and the position of the ICC. And even today, the 15 members of the Security Council, the representative of the occupying authority, the representative of those who committing genocide, was not listening to any one of you, because all of them, they said to you, stop the crimes, stop the killing, stop the starvation, send assistance to the Palestinian people in Gaza, including in northern Gaza. Don't stop the humanitarians from conducting their business. You don't listen. You listen to the noise in your head, but you don't listen to the distinguished member of the Security Council, who are some of them advising you with a solidarity with you, and you don't even listen. It's either your way and the highway, and it is going to be the way of the international community, the Security Council, and you are going to be running on the highway. You do not have credibility. You don't listen. And they keep telling you the same messages, still you don't listen. Listen to them. Listen to international law. Listen to what the UN stands for. Don't try to change things and to tailor a system which is a system completely in contradiction with what we all agree to. That will never happen. Wake up. Listen to the international community. Listen to justice. Listen to fairness. Listen to the people who want their hostages to be released, not to be killed on a daily basis. Ceasefire. Ceasefire now. Hundreds of millions of people are saying that in all corners of the globe. Listen to them, including in Israel, including Jews in the United States of America and their youth in universities and colleges. They're telling you ceasefire, ceasefire now. This is how the hostages will be released. You're not listening to anyone. You're listening to extremism, to fanaticism, to the extremists in your government, to the extremists in your society, and therefore you are perpetuating this war. And we will, all of us, led by international law, succeed in either making you listen and understand or forcing you to listen, as all people like you in the past were forced to listen to the will of the people in all corners of the globe and international law and the Security Council. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I reiterate to all participating delegations the importance of maintaining decorum in the chamber. The representative of Israel has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. In my speech, I use the facts. Mr. Mansour, you are an expert of blaming Israel. We don't have to come to your event tomorrow. For 77 years in this organization, you always said no, and you blame Israel for everything. What I'm trying to offer you is future, to discuss future for Palestinians in Gaza. But in order for that to happen, you have to say no, not to Israel, to say no to Hamas. Once you will have the courage and the ability to say no to Hamas, no to terrorism, you can speak about future for Gaza, you can speak about future of the Palestinians. That's what I'm saying. I'm not taking your position, but I'm telling you that if you want to move forward, you have to say no to Hamas and yes for cooperation. If you want to play the blame game, you became an expert on that. You will continue to do it tomorrow, but look what you did in the last 77 years since Israel was established, and you rejected the partition plan here at the UN. Look what you did personally in the last 20 years that you are sitting here, that you always said no and blamed Israel. Think about the future of the Palestinians. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. The representative of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine has asked for the floor to make a further statement. Can I reassure you we have listened closely to your views, and in the interest of time, I will give you the floor one final time to conclude your remarks. Thank you.
I thank you very much, and I apologize for taking the floor. I challenge the ambassador of Israel. I accept Security Council resolution. I accept General Assembly resolution. We recognize the State of Israel. You are not recognizing the State of Palestine. On these bases, on the basis of international law, on the basis of the Charter, I am willing and eager to chart a path, positive path for peace. You are the one who is refusing all these things. It's not us. Our president came to this Security Council and said many times, I am ready to negotiate the end of occupation. I am ready to negotiate peace and two-state solution living next to each other. It was always you and your government, the rejectionist, refusing to open doors for peace. You want from us to be negated. Your Knesset legislated that only Jews have the right to exercise self-determination between the river and to the sea. You completely ignored us, and you were trying to say that you are for peace and I am against peace. I accept the judgment and the position of all of my colleagues. When we go peacefully and legally and in a very sophisticated way to the General Assembly, asking them, do we deserve the right to self-determination? And when they give me between 170 to 180 votes, saying on the basis of the Charter, the Palestinian people do deserve to exercise their right to self-determination, including a two-state solution, who is the one who is working for peace, and who is the one who shredded the Charter of the United Nations from the chamber of the General Assembly, and who is the one who said in the General Assembly, you are the immoral majority in the General Assembly. It was your representative. Then, my colleagues, I accept their judgment. If we go for a voting among our colleagues, our peers, who is working for peace and who is working for the killing of the Palestinian people as we see it in the Gaza Strip, I think the answer is obvious, but you will not accept the judgment of our colleagues. You want to impose on us your judgment, which is not accepted by anyone, and that's why you are isolated, and you're still insisting to change that reality by distorting the situation, trying to accuse a person who is working all of his life for peace and trying to say that you are working for peace and not the representative of the State of Palestine. That's why I'm telling you, wake up. Listen to those. Many of them are your friends. In the General Assembly, many of them are your friends. They're telling you what you're doing is wrong. Change your behavior, change your policies so that we can have peace, so that we can end this illegal occupation and have a two-state solution. And I will not speak anymore, Madam President, now. Thank you for your patience and all of my colleagues. Thank you.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Tor Wennesland, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, to participate in this meeting, and I give him the floor to respond to comments.
Thank you, Madam President. As this is the last brief that has been delivered to the Council from my side, as presented by my Deputy Mohammed Hadi, let me just add some few words. I think we, on a daily basis, including today, we have got demonstrations in the field and in the council how difficult this situation is at the moment. I can assure members of the council and the representative of Israel and Palestine that this is a very difficult job to entertain in a situation where anyone serious from the UN will have to deal in an impartial way with both sides. I am deeply frustrated that the combined efforts of the Council, of the mediators, and the international community has not succeeded in delivering a ceasefire in Gaza and the release of the hostages. I'm deeply frustrated from my visits to Gaza to see that despite all efforts and with the fear for their own life, it has not been possible to deliver the aid and assistance in the amount needed for the civilians living in Gaza. And yet again, we have to admit that the failure, not only this time, but over time, to try to resolve this conflict politically has led into a dead end, yet again. I outlined the key principle as I see a way to a different path in addressing the conflict before the Council exactly a week ago. These principles still stand, and the Council itself has to 4 resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728 and 2735 delivered their assessment and their decisions on how to move forward on the humanitarian issues. So, at this point in time, we could have been in a better place. Nevertheless, allow me, Madam President, to thank all permanent and elected members of the Security Council during my term for your tireless engagement and support to our work, and to the Secretary General and the Secretariat for your guidance. I especially thank the Under Secretary General Di Carlo and her team in the DPPA. I also would like to use the opportunity to thank the UN agencies, funds and programs operating in the OPT for their dedication. In particular, I wish to recognize the brave and valiant efforts of UN colleagues in Gaza working under unimaginable conditions. I would like also to thank the Palestinian and Israeli governments, their civil servants, and all interlocutors in Israel and Palestine for their continued engagement with me in my work as UN Special Coordinator. And finally, thanks to my colleagues in UNRWA for their commitment, understanding, and professionalism dealing with very difficult issues. It has been an honor to serve for the UN. It has been an honor to work with all of you. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Wennesland for the clarifications he's provided. And as this is his last meeting as Special Coordinator, I thank him for his dedicated service in the position. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.